we talked about the difference between culture being something that is consumed, like it's hip-hop culture has been usurped from storytelling and oral storytelling to clothes and fashion, right? It's commodified. To culture in the majority world, where culture is something that is innate, part of a value system, and an identity.
It's the difference between culture as a noun and culture as a verb. And I think that's where I was kind of getting at with foresight as activism, where I think your assessment is spot on, and I love it, and you articulate it so well. I'm going to steal it. Because the culture, the trend as a noun is something to be consumed and purchased. 100% you're right. It's commodified. And culture as a verb, right? Cultivate, germinate, right? It's this ability to kind of almost override or seed things and to pollinate. The fact that we're eliminating our own roles and our own livelihoods and our own purpose and meaning to ourselves is the signal of viewing a trend as a noun versus a trend as a verb, which is what is the active role in which we're taking in this phenomenon, and how can we shape it in a way that works for our values and works for our morals and works for one another.
Welcome to the Adda. I'm your host, Deepa Mirchandani, founder of the Deep and Meaningful Consultancy. Whether a European salon or an Indian Adda, the tradition to come together to chat over the issues of the day is an old one. In our modern lifestyles, it's hard to find spaces for nuanced conversations, genuine and inclusive dialogue, so we created our own. Adda is the Hindi word for the place where people come together to deliberate, disagree, and move on better for the experience of having had the chance to do it. We wanted to create a space where the topics affecting our world are brought to the fore and unpicked so that we can better understand them and ourselves. We come with a sense of curiosity, and we're believers that better conversations lead to shifts in perspectives, and better perspectives undoubtedly lead to better decision-making and action. We're really pleased that you're here to be part of it. In this episode, we share our conversation with my friend Matt Klein, a cultural theorist and strategist. Matt's a Webby-winning writer, a global speaker, and is a trusted advisor to brands, the UN, investors, philanthropies, and the press to provide provocative, alternative explanations of the zeitgeist. He is currently the head of Global Foresight at Reddit, and he also writes Zine, a personal, sporadic publication critically analysing overlooked trends and our relationship with our tech and media. I really urge you to check it out and subscribe to his newsletter, which is great. There are links in the show notes. In this conversation, we get into it from the go as we get into the findings of the recently launched Meta Trends report that Matt has been painstakingly distilling, collating, and analysing every year since 2017. Given his commitment to foresight being a proxy to activism, understanding these trends, unpicking them, and then challenging and questioning them is a foundation for understanding what is driving us, and maybe more significantly, holding us back. We talk about things like systemic disassociations as a way of blocking out the complexity of our lives, the dependency and use of shortcuts that we hope will get us to feel and be more fulfilled, that unfortunately never do, and the hope that we both have that we can get to a place where we can encourage people to speak openly about the nuances of what creates our cultures and identities in order to collectively shape our futures. I always love chatting to Matt. It leaves me with a smile on my face and feeling energized. I hope you enjoy it too. Welcome. Matt, is an absolute treat to get to chat to you. And I've got so many questions about the research that I could burst. I'm so ready to go. But given what's gone on in American politics this week, I thought I would have a little moment to pause and say, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing. I'm still standing. What's really interesting is that as someone who studies culture literally for a living, who's just inundated with information and data and sources and all of that, there's some moments where there's this disconnect between what feels like normal and what feels like, oh yeah, like of course this is going to happen, or of course this is the direction in which we're heading, and of course this is what inevitably will occur based upon X, Y, and Z that has come before. And then when there is such strong reactions or surprise or oh my God, what? That doesn't necessarily make it any less painful or confusing or hurtful, but there's this disconnect where it's like, oh, like, no, yeah, this is what's happening. And the disconnect between what feels like a norm and what feels the kind of like calibrated in kind of your eyes of like constantly researching and listening and like, oh, wait a second, this is the vibe. And then the disconnect of what feels like the masses of just shock and horror. Again, that doesn't trivialize that, but it makes it almost more disorienting than anything.
And I think what's been really interesting, right, because of the funding freeze and knowing people whose organizations have been affected by it from like a USAID perspective, um, and or knowing people who've lost colleagues because they were working in consulting but on USAID funded projects, or people who are in country and have been given 48 hours to leave type scenarios. I've had that kind of disconnect that you're talking about because I can feel the pain and the empathy towards it. But as somebody who's worked for years looking at sustainable business models and resilience in funding and in creating enterprise solutions, there's a part of me that's like, we haven't built in resilience within our organizations. And so I feel like even as like on a board of organizations where I'm like, where's our runway and how much reserve do we have so that we can survive? Those are things that I think about and I'm super conscious of, and trying to create sustainable funding or at least diverse and not 100% grant dependent mechanisms. And I fully appreciate that not everybody can do that. People are doing on the ground services. It's how are we not prepared for it? Because the writing, again, like you say, the writing's been on the wall.
It is the burden of foresight. It's the burden of foresight. It is hello, 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 hello. Are you listening? Hello. This has to happen. We have to prepare. We have to think ahead. We have to strategize. We have to pivot. And inevitably, when that doesn't happen, it's this, again, disorienting, isolating experience. And, I talk about this from the perspective, which is, apples to avocados, not even a comparison. But I experience this more often than not when it comes to working with brands and organizations and investors and philanthropies, which is very different than that of, systemic government legislation. Like that's a totally different scale. But even on the small scale, it is this experience of like banging heads against the wall for like, that's the living, right? You're banging your head against the wall. Like, can you please listen to me? Hello, something is up. We have to course correct. So this week and this last year and years ahead, that banging heads against the wall experience, I I forecast will be accelerated and exponential and and perhaps stronger.
It's gonna get so messy. But I want to start right. Let's talk about that because you say this is the beauty of foresight. And we're gonna start talking about trends and your research, right? So fully uneducated, can you talk a little bit about the difference between a trend and a foresight? And how you can use one for the other in the ideal world, but actually it's really funny actually that I was reading the report and it's like, who's creating these trend reports? And I used to work at Weber Shandwick. And so like Edelman has the trust barometer and somebody else has the purpose barometer. And it was really hard not to read this as coming from a lens of business and selling shit to people. And I was trying to be like, that's not what he's about. This is not what this is about. And so I had to keep correcting myself as I was reading it. So I want you to talk a little bit about that kind of trend, foresight difference and the nuance.
We're splicing hairs, which I love. Foresight to me, and of course, there's in-group fighting and debate. Foresight for me is the practice of understanding our current moment, what has come before us, and signals of change in order to extrapolate where we're heading next. It is, to me, extrapolation. It is seeing around a corner. It is discerning what vectors of change are more powerful than others. How do we increase our confidence to prepare for what happens tomorrow? Trends, on the other hand, are collections or clusters of signal of change. So to me, the trend is kind of um, the what, it's the thing, it's the node, it's the tangible, it's the collection of headlines. Foresight is what we do with that information. Foresight is the extrapolation, the preparation, the strategy. To complicate this even further, and I think the reason why we're in the mess in which we're in is that there's a third word in here, which is compounding confusion, which is trending. Trending has eclipsed trends. Two very similar but very different words. Trending to me is the headline of the day, the aesthetic, the micro trend, the core, the TikTok dance, the fad, the thing that is gaining all of our attention in this very moment. And because of algorithms and because of how big these things can get, literally trillions of views, we think that that's more important than it actually is. So we see these headlines or we see these conversations and we're like, oh my God, look at all these metrics and validating why this is important and why we should be paying attention to it. So we think that that's the trend. But the trend is the more substantial shift in human behavior, reflecting real human desires. So in this field, we have conflated trending with trends, and we've kind of just stopped there. So now we just think that the core, cottage core, Barbie core, whatever, is the answer key. Not only is that not the answer key, but now we're not even extrapolating. We're not even doing anything with that information. And of course, there are plenty of organizations and teams and individuals employing actual successful foresight. Collectively speaking, when it comes to this trend report fodder, we've eclipsed trending with trends. And then we're not even doing the foresight part anymore. We're not even extrapolating. We're not even strategizing. We're not even thinking about what may happen tomorrow. We're, as Grant McCracken puts it, we're bagging and tagging a whole bunch of different signals and headlines, and calling it quits and saying, all right, thanks, our job here is done. So that's how I separate all of those three things as I see it.
And then, and we're getting into it now, really early on. And I haven't even but given that we're talking about this terminology, right? What struck me as really interesting is when you talk about the edges. And that actually, and in my world, we talk about nodes and collaboration, and we talk about that kind of network creation when you're thinking about systemic shifts. And you talk about nodes and edges in actually a really similar way. And it struck me that, and also patterning. So the language that you're using and the fact that you talk about pollinating and you talk about seeds and this it's very nature centric, and I'm up to my ears in permaculture design at the moment, right? So it struck me as really intentional that you're using nature and living system language to show how you're thinking, to move away from the binary and the linear, which is where this trending crap show is existing. So talk to me.
I appreciate you noticing that. Some of it's intentional, some of it is maybe just my own subconscious playing out. What to kind of tie these two things together, and I don't know if there was an explicit question there. I didn't mean to cut you off, but to me, it's a reaction to where I see the industry as it is today, which is, and this is no disrespect, I should add the disclaimer there, which is someone noticing a cool thing on TikTok that has 1 billion views, and they write a Substack article about it, and then someone creates another TikTok about that article, and we think that that's a real trend, and we're gonna make a report on it. Like, that's kind of an oversimplification, but that's kind of the norm. Like, that's kind of the vibe of what's happening right now. This navel gazing, we think something is more important than it actually is because 3 people are talking about it, and maybe Vice wrote an article, whatever, and yada yada. So to me, what I wanted to do was kind of flip that off, which is like that's not real. And it's not real. And my good friend Nick posed this or framed this as trend laundering or information laundering, where it feels so synthetic and so manufactured that you can. No, we're really good. So we're so quickly. Um, that it's just not real. It's so untethered from humanity. It's so untethered from real lived experiences. It's so untethered from the practice of foresight of helping us understand where we're collectively heading. It is so unattached from that type of thinking that it needs to be worth calling out. Now, what I'm conflicted with is, I share this piece and everyone goes, "Oh yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, this makes sense. Yeah, totally, totally. Oh yeah, yeah, totally." There's no feedback, there's no disagreement. It's like, "Oh yeah, of course. Of course this is what's happening." And then I question to myself, well, if we're all in agreement, then what the hell is happening? Well, why hasn't it changed? If we all agree this is how we should be doing it, we all know this internally, we're all talking about this, what's the disconnect? Then why are we still creating reports based on nonsense? Why are the reports still coming from the same 10 cities? Why aren't we seeking external collaboration?
And this is where, like, I was kind of shocked because when I was reading it, I mean, you start with acknowledging that this information, like, does it constitute a trend if it's only coming from 10 cities?
Probably not. Probably not.
Right? So that was one thing. And then what's the breakdown? Like, what's the kind of interesting nuggets from the cultural perspectives, right? In terms of what are we seeing in Tokyo versus London versus um you've got Sao Paulo. So Sao Paulo is the only place in Latin America. Um, you've got a few Asian cities. Nothing in India with a gazillion billion. So it's like so it's quite interesting. So it was kind of how far do trends go and who do they serve? Because from my background and the kind of the comsy background, it was these like trend indicators were to help companies. It was a
Mhm.
very kind of it was a very corporate, these are the trends in behaviors, these are the trends in thinking, and how do you adapt? So, like, the stuff on experiences and people wanting to be part of something
Mhm.
didn't surprise me, and I left that world over like 15 years ago. And it's obviously not worked, right? Because the sense of belonging, it's not being met by buying stuff. And so we can crave these experiences and the whole let's spend more time in nature, right? But I want you to talk about shortcuts and the delivery deficit that actually underpins a lot of this.
It's all shortcuts. That's all of this.
Right.
It's all a shortcut, right? Using a trend report as a shortcut to understand culture. It's not working. Using just 10 cities to represent the world. It's a shortcut that's not working. So I think what we're really discussing here is, I don't know if it's lack of time, lack of resourcing, maybe it's apathy. I don't know what. That's its own separate conversation. But I think you hit the nail on the head, which is this is really a conversation about shortcuts. Um, and that, we could open up a can of worms about AI. I mean, to me, that's repackaged shortcut. And my hot take here is that we write these headlines. AI is poised to take 50% of jobs. It's like we created AI, we're employing AI, we're using AI, we're writing the headlines about AI. And we pretend as if this thing is happening to us when we're the ones in charge of really everything. So it's like this relinquishing of responsibility. And to me, I think the most fascinating signal in that is this desperation for a shortcut, even if that means unemployment to our own making. In other words, like there's this desperation for the path of least resistance, the least amount of thinking, the how do I optimize and optimize and optimize, or perhaps make the most amount of money. And that to me is a culture of shortcutism. And I think that's kind of underlying a lot right now.
What really struck me in the kind of the trends that you, like the big, obviously you're looking at the meta trends that you outline, right? And so then it's people want less digital time, right? They know that they want less digital time. They want more tactile contact. They're craving the relational. And you talk about mental health in men and the role and which is a massive crisis in terms of the masculine condition right now. And then they want to live longer. Which kind of like the beautiful ironies of all of that.
It's all tensions. It's all tension. This is all tension.
It's when, because I started looking at these together and I'm thinking, actually, what am I learning about the state of the world? Because a lot of these things, I'm not surprised people want less digital time and more connection to nature and more experiential, and those feel like tangible and real to me.
Mhm.
But then there's like, we want to live longer and we want to defy medicine, but you don't want to do the work of what it requires to stay alive in a healthy way, but you want to do it in a tech enhanced way. So again, this is your shortcut, right?
Yeah, it's shortcutism. Um, I was just speaking to someone about just kind of the state of health. And we were talking about like jade rollers and just like all these products sold to us as shortcuts for wellness. With the irony being, drink water, take a run outside, and go to sleep early. Like it's the most effective thing. We know this. We know this. Just eat well. Just eat well and sleep well. And like that in itself has become a meme. Yet we are sold the jade rollers and the mattress that is tracking our heart rate and body temperature. Like, oh my God, the figure on the ground have reversed to such an extreme. And we think you could buy the shortcut. And because that's the message that we're hearing, that's the one that we believe.
And so I was having a conversation this morning about regenerative tourism and well-being, right? And the well-being tourism market's gone through the roof. And then we were talking about what constitutes regenerative tourism, which has become this kind of buzzword at the moment, right? And it's not sustainability. It's an eco lodge with good energy and no plastics. It's about an experience. It's about a mindset.
Mhm.
And I was saying, and I was talking about you and shortcuts because you've been in my brain all week. And we were having this conversation about, yoga retreats and well-being retreats. And I was saying the same kind of, you can spend $200 on a pair of yoga pants and believe that that's the thing that's gonna give you enlightenment. And actually, if you know anything about yoga, you could do yoga in your pajamas. You could do yoga butt naked. It's not what yoga's about. And so has the well-being kind of tourism, it's this shortcut fix. And what differentiates a regenerative experience is one that is lasting. And then how do you create for that lasting? And how does the way in which, and I'm interested in the business model, I'm interested in the way that organizations are structured and designed and flowing, and living in their locations, that will determine whether they're truly regenerative, because that has got to have a knock-on effect about whether the effect is regenerative to the person having it. So that to me felt like that was the connectors in your nodes.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. What I'm thinking about right now is the desperation for messaging that refutes or is the alternative to you have to buy your way to enlightenment. And not only is that message missing, but unfortunately, I think we're also in a moment where it's really uncomfortable and it's really hard and it's often painful. And that self reflection sucks. And I get it. But I don't know where that message is coming from or where we find and this is a broad stroke claim, so excuse me, but where we find that collective ambition for doing the hard stuff and doing the things that require rolled up sleeves, because it isn't the jade roller, I promise you. I just don't, I don't know what is then required for that shift.
And so what struck me, and this struck me as I was watching like the kind of reports out of the American inauguration, and this kind of the lamenting of the line of billionaires, right, who were there. And what struck me is that there was such condemnation from a lot of American commentators, but equally, you've got people who are selling films and shows on Amazon Prime, for example. We are, as consumers, using and buying products that perpetuate that wealth dynamic. So why is there such a disconnect in people recognizing their actions
I
and
don't, yeah.
that condemnation? It's almost like people don't see the connection of the joining of the dots?
I don't think people don't see it. I think it's too perplexing when you do. In other words, the cognitive dissonance that occurs on a daily basis is so discombobulated. Like it is too intense. And the phrase that I've come up with is strategic disassociation, which
Yes.
is you cannot exist today. You cannot thrive without some sort of oblivion, like strategic oblivion. This happens every single day. Um, there's a story about someone who in a workplace is so upset that people were coming to the office with Chick-fil-A. How dare them support Chick-fil-A, yet writing their messages on Slack on their iPhone, which was only gathered because of children mining for rare earth metals. And I mean, you can't acknowledge it all in the same way. People discussing how evil it is that these men are the front row at the inauguration, yet just how disgusting that is while posting about that on Twitter, which is funding Musk. Like there's all of these contradictions, and it's not that people don't see them because I think they're quite obvious or to some people, but we cannot stomach or we can't continue to think properly if we were to pull on all these threads because everything falls apart. Like everything, I think what I'm trying to say is they're all contradictions. It is so messy, it is so complex that we're feeling forced to have to take sides or to make clean breaks because otherwise it's just too you can't process. You cannot process all of the
So then what does that clean break involve?
the clean break is polarization. That clean break is us versus them. It's binary thinking. It is rejection of the gray or the nuanced or the ambiguous or the complex. And that clean break arguably is more dangerous than anything, because we think that things are super straightforward and that those who eat Chick-fil-A in the office are evil. Like there are multiple sides to this, and the 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 tribalism that comes from an attempt of trying to make those clean breaks and think about it in binary thinking, good versus evil, um, arguably is having some detrimental effects to social cohesion.
But don't you think though that there's acknowledging the complex and the messy, right? And acknowledging that nuance has to be part of because your strategic disassociation, it's like a get out of jail pass, right? And ignorance is one thing, apathy is another. And I think you've got your strategic disassociation sits in between. It's like, I kind of know, but I don't want to see it. I kind of know, but I don't want to acknowledge. And that's when we start talking about organizations, like you were saying, right? And systems, like we're not the ones creating them. And actually, all of these companies are made by individuals. And isn't there a bit of by reclaiming that, isn't that part of, and that confrontation, and even recognizing that it's complicated and it's messy and it's a bit icky, that we start to shift so that people can have better flipping connections, that they don't need the jade roller. I love the fact that you use the word jade roller. Just want to put that on the table, that it fills me with joy every time I hear you say jade roller. It's like I had to think about what it actually was. But you then start confronting, just by acknowledging it, right? Not even confronting it.
Yeah.
You start to break down some of these barriers so that you can then have the better conversations, have the connection, have that collaboration, right? And all of these things that if it was one country that you'd looked at, right? Because originally I thought it was just a US centric, right? But 10 countries is better than one, right? And so that these are sometimes like quite alarming realities. And so people can, like you say, people can read them and say, yep, agree with everything you're saying. But then they're not internalizing and feeling what it actually means to read some of this stuff that you're talking about.
Yes. And that goes to Will Katie's explicit quote in the report, which is, we require narratives allowing people to feel things, because without the feeling part, the story's good for nothing. The story's good for nothing. You have to feel the thing. So I agree. I 100% agree.
And so how do we get to that, right? Because I think it's by opening the door and saying, we know what you're craving, but it's really going to require this, and this, and let's support you through that collectively. I don't know. Is that collective kumbaya? I don't know.
I don't know. I don't know if we're going to crack it. I don't know if we're going to crack it on the podcast. There's a prereq here. The prerequisite is not as much the narrative with, the triggering emotions, as much as it is the willingness or the appetite for those things. And I think maybe that's a good starting point. This sounds abstract and I don't exactly know where I want to go with it, but the story is good for nothing if there isn't an audience who's willing to hear or embrace that story or seek out nuance. And I think it's timely with the passing of David Lynch and literally Lynchian thinking, which is, right, like something cannot make sense. And again, timely timely thinking in that it's not that David Lynch put stories out into the world that people were asking for, because no one knew that it was possible, right? No one's raising their hand to say, "Oh, I'm looking for this thing." We didn't know until it showed up. I think the difference today is there the same appetite or appreciation at scale in which would allow a David Lynch to succeed in the way in which he has decades ago. So I think what I'm trying to get at here is what are the prerequisites or conditions where there is appetite? What is needed for people to seek or to appreciate some of those things? Some of the more or surreal. Yeah.
So then this goes into your idea of foresight as activism, right? And
Mhm.
by using David Lynch as your example, it's actually a multimedia type of activism that's required, right? Because just telling people doesn't work. It's non-emotive, right? Um I mean, would people want to watch films about miners or poll tax riots or some, but maybe not the
Yeah.
ones who need to watch it?
Exactly.
But how do we weave in the foresight messaging in a way that people don't know it's foresight messaging and gets them to think differently or think expansively to then figure out what they need to do in order to show up or be fulfilled, right? Because a lot of what you're talking about is actually, it's kind of heartbreaking because it's about personal fulfillment
Yeah.
and community connection.
It is. We're attempting the question is, or the opportunity is, how do you hide the medicine in the food to kind of make it go down? I think it's happening. I mean, the quintessential or kind of the trite example is representation in Hollywood. It's only taken decades and decades and decades. But that to me is a soft form of foresight as activism, the recognition of, oh, wait a second, characters can not just be a certain demographic. So, like,
Mhm.
there's ways in which entertainment can shift and seed thoughts. It feels concerning that we're still on table stakes and kind of like basic bullet points, which is the people on screen can look different before we could even get to what exactly they're saying or doing. And, you know, uh,
Well, DEI is being shot to shit in the US right now.
yeah, so we're
So,
regressing now, I guess.
so
I should watch my stuff.
hopefully
Yeah.
people realize that actually you don't need to have a policy in order to want to be inclusive but apparently there are only two companies that have come out so far to say that. But but yes, I see your point. Like on the positive note,
Yeah.
but the fact
Touche.
that we're
You
having
got me.
but we are having these conversations, right? Because I mean, you start talking about race. I mean, then we're really getting into it because it just gets messier and messier, right? Because DEI as a checkbox does not healthy society make, right? That's your nodes, not your
Exactly.
connectors.
Yes. And it misses the context, which is we are barreling towards a future where the minority becomes the majority, where and perhaps that's what's triggering the stress reactions from people. But we're barreling towards a future where statistically, what a minority skin color may look like is no longer going to be a minority. That will become the majority, and that's just what's happening. So it's this rejection of the context, um, and the ground as well, I guess, which is I don't know, the landscape in which this is all playing out. Like that feels overlooked as well.
So then what are you feeling optimistic about in terms of the possibilities, right? Because bearing in mind that you go in and you work with foresights to help organizations, right? To think tactically, to think strategically, um, in how they shape what they do, right? Rather than what they sell.
Yeah.
Um, and so And also I just want to stress the fact that when you talk about foresight, it's a longer term.
Yes.
Whereas what's a trend? Is a trend a year or is it less than a year? What makes a trend?
Good luck trying to get consensus for a couple of years, a few years. I'll put it at 3. I'll put it at like a 3. You have fads, you have hype, then you have micro trends, then you have trends and macro trends, and then systemic shifts. We're totally splitting it.
I'm so trend adjacent that I don't even the jade roller doesn't even make it to my life.
Stay away. It's messy. You don't want this. You don't want this. Where do I want to go with this? What I'm most optimistic about is this is kind of cliche, but cultural network effects. And what I mean by that is we talk about network effects on regards to like social platforms. That the more people that are on a platform, the more sticky it becomes, the more useful it becomes because you have all of these people. And the more people that you have, the more valuable it becomes because more people come because that's where the value is. And, it's this flywheel. And I think the same thing can be applied outside of, a social platform, but to culture at large. That we have never been so connected and intertwined, and information has never moved so quickly. And the democratization of intelligence in tools and quite literally superpowers have never been so widely shared and freely accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there are some signals, whether that be things like Wall Street bets or the anti-work movement or, pick your poison, where collectively we are realizing how easy it is to mobilize or to create things or to share information, both for better or worse. Better or worse. But to me, that is incredibly exciting because that's a net new thing. Oftentimes, when we think about culture, we talk about trends. It's like, oh no, we've been here before. We've been talking about this for 15 years. You just don't have 15 years of historical context to realize that we've been here before. That said, something like what I'm describing, there needs to be a better name than cultural network effects. I'm sure there is. But that to me is kind of net new in that we really haven't been here before at this progression or this maturity of
Have you seen that documentary Join or Die?
yes.
Right, because this cultural network effect makes me think of Bob Putnam. And that kind of, although he's super localized, but what you're saying is actually we've hit this level where connectivity transcends borders and culture and
Yes. Here's the tension. The tension is because we are so connected, we're still seeking a form of global cooperation that just can't happen. Like, how in the world are you trying to get the entire planet on the same page about the same thing and to get everyone else to agree with you? It's not happening. That said, it shouldn't be a means to an end. We shouldn't be using these networks to try to convince everyone, but rather to use them as off ramps for local engagement or for offline community or whatever it may be, or meetups for local cooperatives and clubs. Like, we're still trying to do it at such a large level because it feels so new and novel, forgetting that, oh no, you can't do it at that scale. It has to be smaller. And back to shortcuts or back to, the mirage of metrics, we think it has to be massive. My audience has to be 1 billion people. No, that's unhealthy.
And it's really interesting you say that, right? Because when we first started the Adda in 2020, during lockdown, everybody had gone online. And it was this massive numbers game of how many people turn up to a Zoom.
Sure.
Because the sky was the limit all of a sudden, right? And you're having these global meetings and you're having these global convenings. And for the Adda, it was like, it could be 12 people max. Because it's like the anti numbers game. Because if you want to have a proper conversation, then it's like maybe 12, but it'd be better if half of those turn up. And I had friends saying to me, it's like, oh, how many people turned up? And I was like, that's not the point.
Exactly.
It's like, actually, the less is more for this, because then people can really share with themselves and show up openly. So maybe that is the...
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think, again, I go back to, what signals are we getting? That message isn't really coming from anywhere. In fact, it's the opposite. I think of a platform like Substack. Substack is telling the world that everyone is a writer and everyone is deserving of a paid audience. So it's this floodgate of, oh yeah, I too can do this. I too can do this. I think about LinkedIn as well. LinkedIn just wants you to connect with as many people as possible. And then as a result, I look at my connection requests and there's hundreds of people with no message who I've never met before. And we're just collecting people. For what? I don't know you. We will never work together unless there is some commonality or baseline. And your commonality can't be that you have someone else in common. Like that's not a real commonality. There's no starting point of, well, there's no intimacy.
Mhm.
And I bring up that as a superficial example, but that signal's not coming from anywhere. Our platforms aren't saying, hey, take it slow, or maybe you don't need 1,000 followers or 1,000 people on your Zoom, because that's not their incentive. Substack's incentive, as much as I love that platform, is how can you have as many people as humanly possible following you, paying for your work, because we skim a percentage of that. And the same thing for Zoom. We want everyone to be in your Zoom call because that's how we get you to pay for higher tiers of Zoom Premium so you can host. So these incentive structures are built for scale, and scale is not working for us. And unfortunately, if the platforms and top-down messaging isn't going to say, hey, prioritize the local, the small, the intimate, or back to Lynch, the ambiguous, the surreal, whatever it may be, where are those messages coming from? And unfortunately, it has to be bottoms up.
But then there's something about redefining scale, right? So rather than scale of number, scale of impact, scale of depth. And it's, and I think where we started with language. And maybe there's a bit of a reclamation of language as part of this.
Yes.
Because it's like words have been morphed into meaning something else. Where now we only think scale means numbers as opposed to depth.
Yeah. I have a talk where the thesis is we're measuring the wrong things. That what we truly care about is loyalty, passion, depth, intimacy, fandom, so on and so forth. These are very hard things to measure. What we do have access to are clicks, follows, streams, etc. So we think that that's the most important thing. Therefore, we optimize for those numbers. And someone raised their hand at the end during Q&A and they asked, well, what numbers should we measure? And I think about your point on language, which is, why are we even measuring anything in the first place? Because as soon as you introduce a number, we forget that numbers are infinite. Numbers go on forever. So once you tie yourself to number as goal, we forget that it keeps going and going and going. Your goal could be 1,000. You forget that 1,001 awaits you. Your goal could be 10 million. You forget that 10,000,001 awaits you. It's this hedonistic treadmill. So back to language. Why again are we relying upon numbers or measurement? And what then is the replacement? And I don't have an answer there besides maybe gut. But that's its own.
But with something like Substack, right? All these, like, where you can be paid for your work, right? It's meant to be a distributed system whereby you have authorship and you can get paid for it. To make it financially viable, you gotta have your numbers,
Of course.
right? And so then, are we thinking in diverse ways of where of livelihoods, so that we can live the lives that we want to live in the way that we want to live them, whereby some of these indicate it's more distributed rather than everything coming from one source, where you do have to think scale, progression, promotion, all those things that drive the bigger number in the paycheck.
Sure. I'll challenge that by saying, if we take one step back, who's to say we should even be monetizing our writing anyway? I do think that's an aspirational goal, but can't a hobby just be a hobby without turning on a paywall? Can't I film myself or make a dance or whatever it may be without striving to be an influencer with paid brand endorsements? So even if we do think
Completely.
about, yeah. So if we
But
think
then
about scale and we think about money,
but why are
yeah,
people doing it? But people are doing it so that they can do what they love and get paid, right?
that
Or is it, I don't know, or is it scammy? I don't know.
I've been asked that question exactly before. I don't know, because I've been presented with that. And the idea is, well, you go through the ringer, you build your audience, you have enough financial cushion. Now you can do what you want. And you look at a lot of celebrities or a lot of like the top percentile, and we have to ask, are they any happier? Are they finally doing work that, they're flipping off and, flipping off the studios and only doing projects that they care most about? It's this example of audience capture, which is, we think that like one day I'll reach the point, I'll reach the number, whether that be followers, whether that be money, I'll reach the point where I can now do my thing. Does that happen? I don't know. I can't point to a lot of people who've like made it to the milestone and then they're like, oh, now this one's for me.
Oh, I don't know. You need to hang out with more kind of regenerative do-gooder types. There's some
Probably.
very easy to get out of corporate world. But no, I can think of a couple that I know, but they've made it, right? They've made what they feel like is enough, and are happy with that.
But I think that's the tension. We're nailing the tension, which is they're likely not right on a Hollywood screen, top-down amplified broadcast messaging, right? So back to, what are the stories in which we see or hear establishing norms or the status quo? So we continue only to see the people in the quintessential rat race, or the, oh, one more, or it needs to be big for big sake, right? I'm only seeing the newsletters, right, that have 1 trillion followers. So when we keep seeing that as the only thing, that instills the message that, oh, I too need to be like that. Or even, Mr. Beast or David Dobrik or Addison Rae, these, Gen Z influencers. Just because they also use iMovie or GarageBand or an iPhone doesn't make their success any more attainable or any more healthy to reach towards. So when we see these as models, we think, oh, that will be me. That can be me. I'll be happy when I reach that point. They're the top 0.00001%. Yet there's this mirage of, oh no, they're happy. Like, is Taylor Swift happy? Do we think that she's happy? I don't know.
I hope she is.
I hope so as well. But I imagine that grind. I'm like, it's a grind. That's a grind.
I don't know, but I don't know very much about Taylor Swift, but the fact that she managed to like take ownership of her material,
Yeah.
and say screw you to the corporation that was taking the chunk of the vast majority of the money, and she's a singer, songwriter, producer. The fact that she got to a place where she could then have agency to do what she wants to do, that I think is going to be massively satisfying. And so on that, for having the chops to do that, and she gets a lot of stick from all kinds of places, but that to me is you're getting to a place where you can then assert agency, and maybe. And I was having a conversation recently about choices, right? And maybe actually, like, success is about having the freedom to make choices.
Yes. Oh, for sure.
for
sure.
ourselves, right?
I
And not
don't.
be and whether that's influenced by finances, it's love, it's where you live, it's how you live, it's who you live with, all of those things, what
Yep.
you eat and where you eat it.
Mhm.
And then the ecosystem around that, right? Of what gives me agency.
Yeah. I question, and I agree with your assessment on Taylor. My my question would be whether or not her experience is the anomaly and the exception, or rather that's the norm.
She's a white woman. um,
There you go.
just saying. Would others have been so lucky? Not sure.
So again, I go back to what messages are being kind of fed back into the system. I mean, without making too far of a leap back to the trend reports, in that these are self-fulfilling prophecies, that the ecosystem is so fragile. I was just giving this talk, and I I end it in kind of a snarky way where I mention this very bizarre phenomenon where increasingly I find myself quoted in the trend reports to support their trends from things that I have shared or written or spoken about publicly. And it's this jump scare experience. And beyond the fact that that's really mortifying, to me, it's a fascinating signal. And it's an opportunity. And the insight being how fragile the ecosystem really is. Because all it takes is one quote, it takes one story, it takes one case study, it takes one example of a brand doing the thing that no one else has done for that then to be picked up and then fed back into the system. It's this Ouroboros, or the snake eating its own tail. And I think whether that be for entertainment, whether that be for organizations and brands, it takes a little bit of zagging for then that to kind of catch on. And we're playing it so safe right now, copying and pasting what everyone else is doing, thinking that that's the way in which you resonate in culture. There's an opportunity to take one kind of step out, and then you'll see that, oh, that gets put into the report. And then that's what everyone else begins doing. It's very cyclical.
And but with that, and I think the danger in that, and we haven't talked about it yet, and I'm conscious of time, but we're clubbing people together, right? And we make homogenous assumptions, right? Which is why, it was like, oh, I'm interested in this demographic, right? Of like, if it's 10 different countries or 10 different cities, then what is the difference between Europe and LATAM or the US and Asia? And where do those nuances sit? Because culture and identity, and one of the things when like doing my regeneration course, we talked about the difference between culture being something that is consumed in the West, where you consume the arts and you consume, you go to the theater and you buy, like, it's hip hop culture has been usurped from storytelling and oral storytelling to clothes and fashion, right? It's commodified, to culture in the majority world, where culture is something that is innate, part of a value system, and an identity that is expressed through the arts. And that expression is the manifestation of a value system and a storytelling tradition, or a inherent value base. And these are very different approaches to culture. So when we talk about cultural trends, right, and we read about loneliness, or we read about disconnection, and we read about isolation and confusion, I'm really curious as where the nuance sits with that, as somebody who has dual like slightly wonkiness about me, right? In terms of the British and the Indian. And so I'm kind of curious what your views are on that.
It's the difference between culture as a noun and culture as a verb.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I was kind of getting at with foresight as activism, where I think your assessment is spot on and I love it and you articulate it so well. I'm going to steal it because the culture, the trend as a noun is something to be consumed and purchased. 100% you're right. It's commodified. And what you articulated so well that I was unable to is that we forget the agency in which we have here. These are not answer keys, but opportunities to ask questions, opportunities to find empowerment and autonomy within that Ouroboros or the snake eating its own tail. And culture as a verb, I mean, right? Cultivate, germinate, right? It's this ability to kind of almost override or seed things and to pollinate and to, and again, I think of germinate in cultures like yogurts and bacteria, and memes and things that are spreading. Um, so again, back to messages and stories. Um, I think you nailed it. It's not just a thing to capture and bag and tag and consume, but rather an ecosystem that we could play an active role within and shape ourselves. And to your point, that integrates values and morals. The prerequisite there is, are we aware of what we want to seed and what we want to kind of shape ourselves? It's open-ended, but
this
yeah.
also goes back to the shortcut, right? And we will buy all the gizmos, but not do the work that will get us to culture being a way of being rather than something that is consumed and happens to us or we're being hit with.
Well,
Right.
that goes back to the AI thing too, right?
Yeah.
That's AI as a noun rather than AI as an opportunity or a verb to shape what works best for us. The fact that we're eliminating our own roles and our own livelihoods and our own purpose in meeting to ourselves is the signal of viewing a trend as a noun versus a trend as a verb, which is what is the active role in which we're taking in this phenomenon, and how can we shape it in a way that works for our values and works for our morals and works for one another.
And I think if we did that, then the nodes will never be just nodes because you'll always have your edges and your connectors because you're seeing it differently, right? And I think if we showed up with that, then it would feel a little bit less scary. And just to read something that you wrote, it was like, strategize for a world where fact is eclipsed by vibe. I found terrifying because of this. Because for the kind of that connection, the kind of the spiritual, and I don't mean spiritual from a religious sense, I mean it from a feeling like you are part of something and this kind of universal belonging sense of spirit, then why the hell am I like the idea of a vibe freaks me the hell out. I'm genuinely scared.
But I don't think that's the future. That's kind of today. That's happening. That science, numbers, fact. So what? Criminal records. So what? Come back to the White House. And that's not a political statement. That's the ways in which we're approaching culture. That objectivity is kind of moot. Doesn't really matter as much as perhaps, I don't want to say maybe it's mattered less than it has. I don't, have we been here before? I don't know. For this moment, at least, yeah, vibes run the show. Gut feelings run the show. Subjective morals run the show.
But
And that's a
isn't there,
terrifying place to be.
to me, I see optimism, even though that's super dark. Everything you just said, super dark, and I don't like it. But isn't there then hope for others to show up. And for that collective tissue that you were talking about to be flexed, because you have to now show up. Because who we are and what we stand for and what and morals and the kind of that vision has to mean something, because we are defending something.
I see optimism. I don't see the optimism that way. I don't disagree with it. The way in which I see optimism is the recognition that rules don't apply and the rules of the game don't matter.
Yeah.
And there's a realization of, oh, wait a second, if the rules of the game don't matter, ... the opportunity, the optimism being, oh, cool, we get to make them. We get to make this work in the ways in which it benefits us. That's the optimism that I see. Will we get there? We'll find out soon.
No, but there's interesting in that, right? Because it's the rules of the game. But we know that the game is fundamentally flawed in lots of ways, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so when we use phrases like rules of the game or seat at the table, it's, should we be wanting a seat at the table, or should we want a different flippin' party where everyone's standing? And so there's something in that for this kind of more localized, much more tangible, much more tactile, much more connected mobilization, maybe, in whatever form, right? It doesn't have to be like we're alluding to the political, but it could be, I don't know, kids' playground. I don't know. I'm trying to think of something that
I think
nothing about.
No, I think it's happening, and we see this. We see this play out in the workplace as one example, where younger demographics are, right to that point, not playing the game. The game's rigged, right? If I'm going to give you all my time for money, and the money is not enough to afford a home, screw this. I'm gonna play a different game. That game, unfortunately, may be sports gambling or NFTs or crypto or shit coins, but that's at least a different game. That at least is an alternative that exists. So I do think there is optimism to be seen within that, which is, oh wait, I agree. If the game is flawed, or if the table doesn't have room, oh cool, I'm not even gonna fight for for a seat there. I could do something that works for me. There's another table over there.
And I think there are opportunities for the work that, like, we're kind of committed to, of bringing together people, right? To play with and say, right, how do we play together to create something? And so maybe that's I don't know, just maybe I'm trying to hold on to something hopeful here, but it does kind of, I find I'm finding more and more, like, I do want to just play with people that I can have that kind of energetic with, right? Because that's way more fun.
Totally.
So maybe that's what we do.
We're doing it.
We're doing it. Is there anything, I'm really conscious of time and you need to go, but is there anything about the research and the trends that I haven't asked you about but should have? Or anything that you thought we were going to talk about that we haven't?
No, we covered a lot of ground. No, I think the one point that I really want to make with the meta trend work and kind of foresight as activism is what we ultimately require is, it's the cliche of all cliches, but the confidence to not look at someone else's page to try to copy them, to think, oh, well, if that's the trending thing, then I have to write the same thing because that will posture me as hip and cool and I know what's happening. To reject that and to find the confidence of creating blueprints for things that we want to see. The phrase is preferred futures. The danger here is preferred is completely subjective.
Mm-hmm.
But there's an opportunity within this type of a deliverable or within this type of thinking. Can we seed and can we pollinate? Can we push messaging out to cultivate cultures that are more human, that are more intimate, that are more ambiguous, that are more nuanced, that are more gray? And we view this report as an answer key or something to be locked into, or this checklist in order to resonate. And my probe is viewing these reports as an opportunity for blueprints. What do we want? How can we sketch out what would be fun or cool or healthy or mindful or artistic or sustainable? Because this work sits upstream of so much significant change and social influence and capital and innovation that I don't think it's worth burning it all down and saying, oh, this stuff's rotten, but rather viewing it as an opportunity of like, okay, there's a there. We need this. We think it's important. We're going to invest money into this type of research and thinking and these deliverables. How do we do so responsibly?
And I think one of the beautiful things that you do in the research is welcome the challenge, right? And like ask questions, question your own opinion. Who are you talking to? Right? And I think that kind of that encouragement of talk to other people before, as you look at these trends or as you look at this information, who are you checking it with? Even if they're people you don't agree with. In fact, even more important, go and find the people that you don't agree with.
Exactly.
And sense check the shit out of all of this. To really unpick it. And I think that's got to be the biggest offering, right? Is unpick and question and challenge rather than just say, oh my God, this is really interesting. Thank you very much.
That's all we got. All we got is one another and our thinking and our skepticism and dialogue. How do we dial that up in a productive manner?
And so what do people need to do in order to get into the messiness of trends with you? Apart from subscribe, read the report, subscribe to your zine, which I think is phenomenal.
Thank you. Say hey, reach out. My email's on the Substack. I'm on LinkedIn. I answer everybody. Just say hey.
Wait. You will only respond to those who actually have a tangible message on LinkedIn.
That's what I mean. Yes. Yeah. If you're sending, you will be acknowledged. And just say hey. I'm so passionate about this work, and I want to share it, and I want to talk about it, and I want to, more than anything, integrate it and act upon it, because the research is only as good as what we do with it and where we take it. So that's the invitation.
Thank you so much for being here, and sharing your time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. It's been a blast.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of The Adda. The Adda is brought to you by the Deepa Meaningful Consultancy. Production is managed by Urban Luka, and our music is from the song Unreasonable World by the talented Bernard Schimpelsberger. To find out more about the Deepa Meaningful Consultancy, to sign up for our monthly newsletter, and also check out our group Adda sessions where we host small spaces for big messy topics, please check out www.deepameaningful.co. We'll see you next time.